1943. A Nazi steps off a train in Texas. It is a scene of staggering, almost surreal absurdity. The setting is the small, dusty town of Hearne, Texas. The man is a member of the Afrika Korps, captured in the sands of Tunisia, now blinking in the harsh Texas sunlight. He is surrounded not by the chaos of battle, but by the quiet, sun-baked landscape of America's Deep South. This was not an isolated incident. This single soldier was one of over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war, Germans, Italians, and Japanese, who would eventually be housed within the borders of the United States during the Second World War. And the epicenter of this extraordinary, unbelievable historical footnote, this massive, secret foreign presence on American soil, was Texas. By the war's peak, Texas hosted more than 70 primary POW camps and countless smaller branch camps, housing over 50,000 German prisoners alone. The sheer scale of this operation, its profound impact on the local economy, and the astonishing internal conflicts and secret missions that played out within these barbed wire enclosures represent Texas's forgotten secret. How German POWs changed World War II history right under America's nose. The story begins with a logistical nightmare. Following the massive Allied victories in North Africa in 1943, particularly the surrender of Army Group Africa, the United States was suddenly faced with a colossal problem: what to do with tens of thousands of highly trained, indoctrinated Wehrmacht soldiers. Shipping them back to Britain was impractical. Keeping them near the front lines in North Africa was too risky. The solution, hatched in Washington, D.C., was audacious: bring the war spoils to the American interior. Texas was the perfect, if bizarre, choice. It offered vast, empty tracts of land, a climate that, while hotter, was survivable, and crucially, it was thousands of miles from any potential enemy threat. The camps were often built on or adjacent to existing military training installations, such as Camp Swift near Bastrop, Camp Bowie in Brownwood, and the infamous Camp Hearne. Camp Swift, for instance, became a massive processing center. Imagine the scene: thousands of battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern and North African fronts, men who had faced the British at El Alamein and the Americans at Kasserine Pass, being systematically registered and sorted by low-ranking American officers and support staff in the middle of a Texas prairie. The initial arrivals were a chaotic mix: elite Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, U-boat sailors, and the tank crews of the Afrika Korps. The American War Department was initially overwhelmed. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed the treatment of POWs, was strictly adhered to by the U.S., a commitment that would soon cause profound internal conflict within the camps themselves. The regulations mandated that all prisoners be treated humanely, that officers could not be forced to work, and that non-commissioned officers, NCOs or Unteroffiziere, could only be assigned supervisory roles. This adherence to international law, intended to protect American soldiers captured overseas, inadvertently created a breeding ground for the deepest, darkest secret of the Texas camps: the continuation of the Nazi regime, not just in spirit, but in brutal, physical practice, right under the noses of their American captors. Within the barbed wire, a shadow government took hold. The vast majority of the German prisoners were, unsurprisingly, committed Nazis, or at least fiercely loyal to the Wehrmacht hierarchy. The senior German officers and the Unteroffiziere quickly established a rigid self-policing structure. They enforced military discipline, complete with formal salutes, rank insignia, and the singing of Nazi songs. The problem lay with the minority: the anti-Nazis, the Social Democrats, the older men, and the newly conscripted who had no taste for Hitler's ideology. These men, seen as traitors or defeatists by the hardliners, were immediately targeted. Camp Hearne became the most notorious example of this internal reign of terror. It was designated as a high-security camp for the most fanatical prisoners, a decision that proved disastrous. Here, the SS and the most committed party members held sway. Declassified military police reports from 1944 and 1945 detail a horrifying pattern of intimidation, severe beatings, and even murder, all orchestrated by the Nazi clique to maintain ideological purity. The murders were chillingly simple and effective. A dissenting prisoner would be found dead, often ruled a suicide by hanging, or sometimes simply beaten to death in a dark corner of the barracks. The perpetrators, protected by the silence of the Nazi majority and the American reluctance to interfere in what they saw as internal discipline, often escaped justice. One documented case involved a prisoner named August Scheyer who dared to express anti-Hitler sentiments. He was found hanged. Though officially ruled a suicide, the evidence strongly suggested he was murdered by his fellow prisoners, a clear message to anyone considering abandoning the Führer. The American authorities, constrained by language barriers, a lack of dedicated intelligence officers, and the immense logistical burden of running the camps, struggled to contain the violence. This invisible war, fought with fists, fear, and rope, was a profound embarrassment to the U.S. Army. It highlighted a critical failure in the initial camp design, the mixing of fanatical Nazis with genuinely anti-Nazi prisoners. It demonstrated that the war of ideology was not confined to the battlefields of Europe. It was raging, silently and lethally, in the heart of Texas. The U.S. War Department eventually realized they were inadvertently hosting a functioning Nazi microcosm. Their response was the establishment of a highly secretive and ultimately history-altering program, the Intellectual Diversion Program, later known as the Truth Program. The goal was radical: De-Nazification. The Americans began to identify and segregate the anti-Nazi prisoners, often referred to as screened prisoners or white tigers. These men were moved to special, top-secret camps, often disguised as regular facilities, where they were exposed to a relentless barrage of pro-democracy, anti-Nazi material. They were given access to uncensored American newspapers, magazines, and books. They watched specially curated films, not Hollywood propaganda, but documentaries showing the horrors of the concentration camps, the extent of Allied bombing of German cities, and the true scale of the war that Hitler had hidden from them. In camps like Camp Mexia, a quiet revolution was taking place. The anti-Nazis were treated almost as guests, provided with better food, better accommodation, and, crucially, the intellectual tools to rebuild a democratic Germany. The Americans were essentially training the future leadership of post-war Germany on the plains of Texas. Declassified records show that the U.S. was not just running a prison system, it was running a political laboratory. The men who went through this program, architects, engineers, teachers, would return to Germany after 1945 with a unique, uncorrupted vision of democratic society, having seen it function firsthand. This was the most profound, secret way these German POWs changed World War II history. They became the seeds of the Federal Republic of Germany. But the vast majority of the prisoners were not involved in political re-education. They were involved in something far more practical and far more essential to the American war effort: work. The Texas agricultural economy, like many others across the U.S., was suffering a severe labor shortage. Young American men were fighting overseas, leaving vast fields of cotton, sugar beets, and peanuts to rot. The solution was lying dormant behind barbed wire. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, non-officer POWs could be compelled to work for wages. And work they did. By 1944, German POWs were a vital, indispensable part of the Texas agricultural machine. Branch camps sprang up near every major farming area, turning the prisoners into a massive, subsidized labor force. The prisoners were paid 80 cents per day in script, redeemable only at the camp commissary. They harvested cotton in the Panhandle, picked vegetables in the Rio Grande Valley, and cut timber in East Texas. The local farmers, initially suspicious of having Nazis working their land, quickly came to rely on them. Testimonies from Texas farmers are nearly universal. The Germans were efficient, disciplined, and hard-working. This massive labor program was, in itself, a shocking paradox. These were the men who had been fighting to destroy America, now literally saving the American economy. Consider the numbers. The total value of the labor performed by POWs across the U.S. exceeded $250 million in 1945 dollars. In Texas, the cotton harvest alone was saved by the hands of the Wehrmacht. The labor was so effective that, in some areas, local businesses and farmers actively lobbied the War Department not to move the prisoners, even as the war was drawing to a close. The treatment of the prisoners was, by and large, excellent, often better than their American guards. They were fed the same rations as U.S. soldiers and given recreation facilities. They built elaborate recreation centers, held theatrical performances, and even studied for post-war qualifications. The irony was not lost on the American press, which occasionally ran articles criticizing the country club atmosphere. The treatment of the prisoners led to one of the most surprising twists in the entire saga: the deep, often complex, relationship that developed between the prisoners and the local Texas communities. While strict non-fraternization rules were in place, human nature and necessity often intervened. Farmers' wives would leave extra food for the work crews. Children would cautiously approach the wire to exchange cigarettes for hand-carved wooden toys. In some documented cases, prisoners who worked on remote farms became almost members of the extended family, sharing meals and conversation with the farmer and his wife. The escapes, when they occurred, were often more comical than threatening. The most famous escapes usually involved a simple desire for a better meal or a bottle of whiskey, rather than a genuine attempt to return to Germany. The vast, empty landscape of Texas was itself the best prison guard. A German soldier, speaking no English and wearing a uniform that marked him instantly, stood no chance of remaining free for long in the middle of a ranching community hundreds of miles from the Mexican border. One notorious escape from Camp Bowie involved a prisoner who simply walked off the work detail, only to be found a few days later sitting on a park bench in Brownwood, waiting patiently to be picked up. He was tired, hungry, and had realized the absurdity of his situation. As the war ended in 1945, the logistics of repatriation became the next great challenge. The prisoners could not simply be dumped back into a shattered, occupied Germany. They were held for months, even years after the cessation of hostilities, continuing to work on American farms and in industries until transport could be arranged. The final departure of the German prisoners from Texas was as quiet and unassuming as their arrival. They left behind not only the work they had done, the harvested fields, the repaired roads, but also a subtle, lasting cultural footprint. Many of these men, having spent 2 or 3 years experiencing American life, food, and culture, returned to Germany with a profound understanding of the former enemy. They took with them a respect for American efficiency and, in many cases, a deep appreciation for the democratic ideals they had been secretly exposed to. The legacy of Texas's forgotten secret is not just a tale of confinement. It is a story of profound, unintentional cultural exchange and political reengineering. The U.S. Army, by adhering to the Geneva Convention, inadvertently created a space where the Nazi ideology could violently self-destruct and where a new, democratic Germany could be quietly, secretly incubated. These German soldiers, who arrived as the enemy, left as the unwitting architects of post-war German democracy, having saved the Texas economy in the process, all while a silent war of ideology raged within their ranks. It is a chapter of WWII history that is almost too unbelievable for fiction, yet it played out, day after day, year after year, under the blistering sun of the Lone Star State. Which POW story should we cover next? A. The Sheriff. B. The Christmas Truce. Comment.